There's been a bit of a sentiment with this generation of games that it came out a little too soon, which is kind of half true. You know, there's the idea that systems were ready when they were ready.
Let me now unveil Xbox.
Hardware made sense and it was all lined up, and then a lot of stuff happened in 2020 that you're probably aware of. And that derailed a lot of game development and stuff kind of being ready. And not only that, but I think this generation in general was just a little more primed for it to just be not as significant of a transition from last gen. Don't get me wrong, I have thoroughly enjoyed both using the Series X and the Series S, and for me, especially with what I do for work, it's been really worth upgrading right away, and I've been enjoying the performance benefits that they have to offer. But I can understand why, from a lot of other people's standpoints, it doesn't really feel like there's any massive need to have to upgrade right away right now. And while this is true across both the PlayStation and Xbox, it's definitely been a little more true in Xbox's case for one particular main reason. In the 2 years that I've had these systems, I've really done my best to balance out how often I'm using each one, although to be honest, I've definitely ended up using the Series S a little more, not necessarily out of preferring this particular system, but really just the fact that this is the one I have at home, this is the one I have at the office, and I play games at home a lot more over the course of the year. And in these 2 years, alongside news that has dropped and things that have changed and all that kind of stuff, I've definitely had some slight change of opinions about these systems and whether or not it was worth upgrading when I did, how soon it's worth upgrading, and really just how I feel about these. And I don't want to start yelling out that Xbox has no exclusives and there's been absolutely nothing, because that's frankly not true. There's been quite a few exclusive titles released for Xbox that are cross-generation with the Xbox One, but it has overall been on the slow side. I mean, as far as major titles that you could consider console movers in a sense, we've basically had two. Halo Infinite, which had a great campaign and a more than mixed reception to its live service multiplayer aspect, and Forza Horizon 5, which is completely fantastic, but sadly, racing games in general don't tend to be the things that completely move systems for a lot of people. Though as someone who's not really into racing games generally, I will say I really enjoyed it and loved it, and it's a great way to round out your library. And aside from these two in the last 2 years, there have been some other exclusive releases. We got Grounded from Obsidian, which was in early access for a while and now has completely fully launched. Pentiment is just around the corner, which I'm personally really excited about, but I understand why it's not necessarily the #1 holiday game everyone's looking towards. There's a lot of multi-platform stuff that has shown a little bit of extra favoritism for advertising on Xbox's side. There are also some things that were timed exclusives for PlayStation that have begun coming over to Xbox as well, like we saw happen with Deathloop and will more than likely happen with Ghostwire Tokyo next year, considering they are owned by Bethesda. But the list is overall pretty short. Part of this has to do with the fact that a number of games have been repeatedly delayed. Stalker 2 was meant to be earlier this year and got delayed for very obvious, understandable reasons, but other titles as well, like Redfall and Starfield, were targeted for this holiday season and are now taking place in early 23, which does kind of put an extra damper on that kind of window of what's been released in the first 2 years of the console, but it does make 2023 really compelling to me. You know, one of the things that's been an ongoing talking point for Xbox since basically the midpoint in the Xbox One generation has been the idea of really beginning to see the payoff of all the studio acquisitions that Xbox has had. Because while they've picked up a lot of studios, aside from some new releases in series that we were probably going to see be Xbox exclusives anyways, like Forza Horizon, there's really not a ton of games that have fully began releasing yet, and that dam appears to be breaking in 23. Again, Starfield and Redfall are both slated for early next year. The devs behind Stalker 2 have expressed wanting to release next year, which we'll see whether or not that happens, because again, pretty understandable circumstances why that game is getting delayed. The new Forza Motorsport is also slated for next year, and there's a number of titles that don't really have a definitive year attached to them, but I think 23 is at least a distinct possibility for them, with stuff like Hellblade 2 and personally, I'd love to see Avowed. I don't want to focus too much on the idea of this future because, again, this is really more about how the system's been for the first 2 years, but I think it's a really important context to look at. Yeah, these first 2 years have been a little bit on the dry side, especially due to what games have been delayed, and I'm very curious to actually see how the next year is going to look in retrospect once more things begin to finally release. One other thing that's been a major focus for Xbox that has been more successful is, of course, Game Pass. This has been the really heavily pushed thing that was introduced near the end of the Xbox One lifecycle and is now becoming a very strong focus during this current generation, namely because it's not only giving access to a lot of great single-player games, and they're really trying to get a lot more variety of stuff on there, but the fact that, you know, compared to a lot of other similar services out there, Game Pass is the only one that is putting major first-party titles on there right away. You know, I've talked about Game Pass here and there over the past couple of years. I'm not sure how much I've really fully stated my, full opinions on it, which are that honestly, I think it's a really great service and I love the fact that it's an option. I never want to see a subscription service like this become the only way to access titles. The moment exclusivity gets involved in situations like this is where things start to not feel as great to me. I mean, this is something that I've been critical about with Nintendo Switch Online, where, you know, it's great that there's a way to access these retro titles, but I'd love to be able to just buy some individually to have permanently, because there's stuff that I want. And so I've been really happy that so far Game Pass has really leaned into just being another option and not necessarily the only way to get a hold of something. Now, if that door ever opens in the future, not something I'm going to be very happy about. But for now, I really do like the concept and current execution of Game Pass. As far as my general everyday use and experiences with using both of these systems, and I think the really important question here is, you know, if someone's out looking to grab a system, whether or not it's worth paying the extra to get the Series X, or if you're actually fine getting the cheaper model. And a part of this, of course, comes down to personal situations, circumstances, what you have, what you don't have, what you're interested in spending, all that kind of good stuff. And the thoughts that I've been really having a lot lately is that, look, if you're looking to just get your one home console and you want it to be an Xbox, you basically have to get the Series X. I mean, the ability to support having physical games, the larger hard drive, better performance across the board, and it's not just about resolution, sadly. If it was, I think that'd be great for both systems, but there are a number of games where ultimately performance is just a lot better on the Series X. That's the way you want to go. That said, I actually really love the Series S, and what I love it as is a fantastic secondary system. You know, if I wasn't doing what I do for videos and I was just going to, you know, get my collection of systems, I really do think the current situation would be I'd have my Switch, I'd have a PS5, and I would have a Series S as the way to access both Game Pass and Xbox exclusives. I've really embraced Xbox specifically as being a digital-only thing, both because of Game Pass and just because a lot of the games that I pick up on there, I feel fine having digital, whereas PlayStation and Nintendo, there's a lot more kind of, you know, longer-running franchises and things that I've been collecting over the years that I absolutely must have physical copies of because that's just the way my brain is wired about it. Again, one of the biggest problems the Series S runs into is its smaller storage size, which is something that I think doesn't matter as much if it's not your only system, because ultimately you're using this for potentially more specific games. The one that's kind of more of a mixed bag is, again, the performance drop-off versus Series X. I wish it was the case that across the board games would just run similarly and it was just a difference of resolution, but that just isn't the reality that we're in. There are numerous games that, either because of how cross-generation support works, because it's relying on the Xbox One version of things, or just the way that some current gen titles are prioritized and optimized for each platform, the Series S just happens to fall behind in a number of third-party titles. You know, one particular example of this I ran into recently is that I wanted to go back to play Sekiro because I never actually got around to finishing that specific game. But one of the things about that is the Series X version of the game, because it's based on the Xbox One X version of the game, you get a nice smooth 60 frames. The Xbox Series S version of the game, however, still runs at a lower, less stable frame rate because it's limiting itself based on the original Xbox One version. And that kind of sucks to have to deal with. This is the part, again, where I think the concept of it being a secondary system is important, because if there is any developer who's going to ensure that the Series S version is going to have amazing performance and really stay neck and neck with the Series X, it's going to be first-party developers, everyone who's underneath the Xbox umbrella and is really given the tools and priorities to make sure that happens. And so when your goal of having an Xbox system is it being your secondary one for things like Game Pass or Xbox exclusives, this is awesome for that. I know it sounds like I'm really trying to push why this thing is a great pickup, and part of it is because of the fact that I don't think the Xbox Series X needs that push. If you're interested in Xbox and you just want the biggest, best thing, obviously the more expensive one is the way to go. But I really want to stress how actually cool I think the Series S is as something that is more affordable and just a great way to round out your setup if you already have another gaming system and you just want to get one other thing to add to it. You know, like I mentioned earlier, this is what I use at the office, this is what I use at home, and as a result, I do use the Series S a lot more often, and I am oftentimes very pleasantly surprised by how well most stuff runs. Yes, there are those specific situations where I get a headache and I ultimately would rather play on the Series X, but those are the exceptions, not necessarily the rule. Again, the reason why, if you're only gonna get one system, bigger, shinier one is the way to go. But in a multi-system scenario, you know, to quote the great Todd Howard, it just works. And this is really the biggest thing in my mind that has changed over the last 2 years of using these consoles. Game Pass, I think, has been a continually growing thing, as I thought it was going to be back in the day. Console exclusives have continued to be an issue, and that is hopefully changing in the very near future. But the Series S versus Series X argument thing, you know, back at launch, I even made a video saying I changed my mind on the Series S because I was excited for it in concept, and then once I used it, it just felt like a letdown for me in some key aspects, namely the storage size. While that is still a potential headache from time to time, its other merits have really shown through over my use of it. I definitely have come to agree with the concept that in many ways this current generation just came a little too soon, and I think a little extra time to bake, not even necessarily for the hardware itself, but just to have the software surrounding it to be ready for it would have been a better move. But at the end of the day, I have been happy with the performance that these current gen systems have had to offer, and I'm much more excited to see how that's really going to shape up over the course of the next year as we begin to see a lot of these long-awaited titles start to finally come to market. So those have been my thoughts on using the Series S and Series X over the last couple years. And as you may have guessed, this is a bit of a two-parter situation. Today is the anniversary of Series X and Series S coming out. In a couple days, it's going to be the anniversary of the PS5's release, and I am going to be talking about that as well. So if you don't want to miss out on that or any other videos I'm working on, make sure to subscribe.